Welcome and thank you for joining today's webinar, Cybersecurity, Global Threat, Local Danger. Our presentation will be hosted by members of Lindaberry's Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Practice Group. A recording of today's presentation will be available later this week on our website, along with our firm's YouTube channel. An email will be sent to participants, including a link to today's presentation, as well as copies of the handouts, which are available for download now at the bottom of your screen. We will leave time at the end of the presentation to address any questions. Please use the chat feature on your screen and select Send Questions to Staff. Now, I'd like to turn control over to Robert Anderson and begin today's presentation. Robert?
Thank you, Rich. And I'd like to welcome everybody for attending today. My name is Bob Anderson, as Rich just mentioned, and I'm one of the co-chairs of our Cybersecurity and Data Practice Group. And I'd like to start out by just going over a couple of very, very basic sort of terms. In order for events to actually happen of a cybersecurity nature, someone has to actually get into your system. And there's various ways that they do that. One of which is just simply hacking. It's finding vulnerabilities in either your technology or your software, which allows someone to enter into your system and get access to your data. Phishing is a social engineering concept where those who are looking to get into your system basically prey on your good nature and your ability and need to try to service your clients in your business. And typically people want to respond quickly. They want to get back to people who are emailing them, or they just in general want to engage in social discourse on the system. So they may send something that looks like a LinkedIn invitation, but it's actually just a clever disguise for a methodology of getting you to click on something, which then downloads something into your system, which allows the cybersecurity process to basically fail, and people are at that point into your system. One of the things that they try to get into your system is malware, which is basically malicious software. And that, again, it may track your keystrokes so that it can record what your passwords are, which again allows them to get into further access into your system at other times and places. A variety of malware is ransomware, where they actually try to, once they're in your system, it downloads the malicious software and it shuts down your system and demands that you pay a ransom in order to get access to your system and data again. And again, one of the big reasons for trying to get into your system in the first place is to access personal information like social security numbers, names, and addresses, so that identity theft purposes can be used and monetized the data that they're getting, so that they actually make a profit here. In the headlines, you'd see things like the Equifax breach, which the personal information of 145 million people, that's 45% of the population of the US was compromised, and close to 1 billion customer accounts were compromised digitally in 2016. And the numbers aren't out for 2017, but they're expected to be even larger than that. And the cost of cyber attack damages are estimated to hit $6 trillion annually by 2021. Cybersecurity spending is expected to reach $1 trillion over the next 4 years, and every 40 seconds a business is hit by a ransomware attack. And these ransomware attacks are growing rapidly at 350% per year. It's now a $1 billion industry. And also hackers are searching the Internet of Things, all the smart devices that are out there, your smart TV, your smart refrigerator, your smart everything, are all connected in one way or another to your servers and your computer system. And that's become a good backdoor way for hackers to get into your system. And those devices, those smart devices, are typically not designed primarily for security. They're designed for other purposes in order to make your life easy, but they do often serve as a backdoor way for hackers to get into your system. There was a bank robber back in the 30s who used to go around the country, and he was tremendously successful at robbing banks. And a reporter caught up with him at one point and said, you know, Willie, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, because that's where the money is. And that's really the reason why all these cybersecurity issues are coming up now, because it's a digital economy, it's a digital world, information is worth money, and people want to get access to that information and monetize it. And it's a lot easier than robbing a bank, and you don't end up with some grainy film of you on the 11 o'clock news with a mask on trying to get a few dollars. You can actually get a significant amount of cash without ever leaving your home. And the attacks could come from Moscow, from Cleveland, from next door. You just never know. But it's an easy way to get money. The perception in the world tends to be that it's large companies that are under attack, and businesses that are a little smaller tend to think that their very anonymity is going to protect them. Who on earth is going to come after me? But the fact is that those large companies have really gone to great lengths to improve their technology and their cybersecurity protections. And it's the small and mid-sized banks that are actually much easier to get into because they haven't done that. And so at this point, 62% of cyber attacks are actually directed at small and mid-sized businesses, and at least half of them have reported attacks in the last year. The average cost of a cyber attack was over $800,000 for a small and mid-sized business. That can include litigation costs, costs to investigate what on earth actually happened, getting monitoring services for the people whose information was compromised. And then those businesses lose a lot of their reputation. People don't trust them as much if they know that there's been a hack. So they end up spending close to $1 million in advertising and promotional events trying to get people to come back to them. The danger here is that 60% of small businesses that actually suffer a successful cyber attack are out of business within 6 months because they can't afford those tremendous costs. But yet, despite the fact that that danger is out there, 51% of small businesses do not currently allocate any budget to cyber risk management. Think about those two factors together. There's a 60% chance that if you are successfully attacked as a small business, you're going to lose your entire business. But yet, half of those businesses that are exposed to that danger are not spending anything on cyber risk management. And companies really have to change. They can't continue to ignore the risks, and steps have to be taken. There's a line from W.C. Fields who said that there comes a time in the affairs of man when we must take the bull by the tail and face the situation. And when you take the bull by the tail and look, it's not pretty. It's an ugly situation, but it's something that you can't ignore. What do you do in order to start looking at a way to start protecting your digital information? First step is just to look at what are your crown jewels, what's most important, what's valuable in what you have. Identify what your key data information is. Look at the technology you have to protect it, whether it's firewalls, software to scan through emails that come in to try to detect any kind of an issue. And also penetration testing, which is bringing an outside technology firm in to, on a good-natured and friendly basis, try to break into your system, do penetration testing to see if they can get in. And one thing that I want to mention in connection with that is the importance of attorney-client privilege. If you do this penetration testing, the end result is you get a written report that identifies all the areas where you have problems, where your security is lax. If you are ever breached, you actually suffer a successful attack, the first thing in the people suing you as their Exhibit A in the litigation is going to be a copy of that roadmap that basically shows all the flaws you had and what you did about them. And if you don't do anything about them, it basically is almost admitting that you were responsible and ought to be liable for the damages that these people have suffered. So if you do the penetration testing through your attorney, however, if the testing is being done in order to allow the attorneys to provide legal advice to you on how to protect your technologies and how to comply with the law in its obligations and how you protect those digital assets that you have, then arguably that report is subject to attorney-client privilege. There's a lot of areas where that privilege can be broken, but it gives you a baseline defense so that it doesn't become Exhibit A in the litigation that's brought against you. We have a handout that's been included in these materials that outlines a little bit of the attorney-client privilege protections, and you may want to take a look at that. It's an important area that you don't want to just have something sitting in your drawers at the office showing what all your vulnerabilities are, and then have a report in the litigation showing you did absolutely nothing about any of them. You can't do everything. I mean, businesses have limitations. They have budgets. They only have so much revenues. You have to basically take a look at what you reasonably can afford and prioritize based on the types of assets that you have, the types of technologies you could potentially afford to install in your system, and also the other things that don't necessarily cost a lot of money, but you can do. Just very, very briefly here, the legal aspects of what you're obligated as a business to do are somewhat general. If you're in a regulated industry, such as the finance industry, you're regulated by Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. If you're in the healthcare industry, you're regulated by the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, HIPAA. Those are highly regulated. They'll give you specific details about what you have to do. But for most businesses, they're not subject to those general areas of regulation. You're subject more to the Federal Trade Commission Act. And in there, the U.S. government has basically had a hard time dealing with what should be regulated and what shouldn't. Congress, as you may have noticed, is somewhat divided. It's difficult to pass anything. That's been going on for years. The Federal Trade Commission sort of jumped into the breach and said that if you're a business and you're taking personal information, you're holding personal information like Social Security numbers, names and addresses, possibly driver's license numbers, credit card information, there's a reasonable presumption on the part of the people giving it to you and that are allowing you to hold it that you have taken reasonable steps in order to protect that information. And therefore, since the Federal Trade Commission Act allowed the FTC to monitor and regulate activities that were a breach of consumer protections, they have taken the position that companies that take in this personal information from consumers out there in the world, it's a breach of consumer protections if you haven't at least taken reasonable steps. I mean, what's reasonable can vary. It's not one size fits all. It may depend on the size of your business, the type of assets, digital assets that you're holding, but you do have to take reasonable steps. And if you don't take it, you're going to be legally liable if there's a breach here. You are not going to have any defenses if you haven't taken reasonable steps. The National Institute of Science and Technology has developed some broad standards, and they're not a legal requirement, but they do give some indication of perhaps areas that you ought to look at in evaluating your business. Lastly, the New Jersey Identity Theft Prevention Act doesn't really impose a lot in terms of what cybersecurity protections are required, but it does say that if you do have an incident where access has been provided to unauthorized persons of this personal information that you may be holding about consumers, that there is an obligation to notify the legal authorities in your state. So just be aware of that. A couple of things that you can do that are not expensive, but that will help to bolster your protections against cyber attacks. One, have plans and procedures in place, written plans and procedures. Identify who's supposed to be looking at your protections, your cybersecurity protections, what needs to be done if there is actually an incident, and my partner is going to talk more about that in detail. But have a written plan in place, because the last thing you want to do when you have an incident is just be unprepared and be floundering around. Patches. Software like operating systems, a Microsoft operating system or an Apple software operating system, has vulnerabilities that hackers will try to use in order to get into your system without your consent. As those vulnerabilities are discovered, Microsoft or Apple will put out free patches to try to patch up that hole. Make sure that you're downloading those onto your system and that they're installed promptly. It's free, but if you don't do it, you're going to open yourself up to potential penetration. Do the penetration testing that we just talked about, and do it through an arrangement that provides attorney-client privilege. Make sure that your passwords are reasonably complex and not easy to guess, and that they're changed somewhat regularly. Again, this doesn't cost a lot of money, but it will give you some protection. And the one thing, if there's anything out there that you can do, is train your people. Employee training in cybersecurity issues is the single most important thing that you can do. 69% of all incidents that companies suffer are because an employee has done something. They've clicked on something, they've looked at something, they've tried to respond to something that's not really what it purports to be. And that's how people get into your system. If you can shut down and limit the things that people do, that will go more than any technology you can get almost. That will go a long way towards protecting your company. And the last thing is premiums. And my partner, another partner of mine, is also going to be discussing cyber insurance. It's something you should consider. It doesn't have to be expensive, but it can give you some significant protections. Lastly, in connection with your people and your employees, it's important to instill a culture where people feel comfortable that they can come to you if something happens. If they've typed in something or accessed something or clicked on something and all of a sudden their computer is acting a little strangely, the last thing in the world you want is for them to basically panic and just try to hide it and not get into trouble because they did something. What you want them to do is to come to you and to report it, and the quicker you can address it, the better chance you have to limit the damage. Samuel Goldwyn, the G in MGM, had a situation, had his company where he brought all the employees into his office, and he said, I want you to tell me exactly what's wrong with me and MGM, even if it means losing your job. That's exactly what you don't want. You don't want people feeling like if they report an incident that's happened to them, they don't know what's happening yet, but all of a sudden their computer's acting very strangely, or it's gotten very slow all of a sudden. You want them to report that immediately. And that's very important that you instill that culture, a cyber culture, into your employees. And the last thing I'm going to say is that when you develop these programs are not static. You have to monitor regularly as technology develops, as new techniques for cyber criminals to access your system develop, and as your business itself changes. You need to reevaluate on a regular basis exactly what your plan is, how you're dealing with things, whether your technology is appropriate, whether your employee training is appropriate. And again, as a last thing to say, that employee training is so important because, again, the vast bulk of incidents that happen with these cyber issues are through somebody who is already an authorized user of your system. It's not just some random person finding a vulnerability and getting in. It's more an employee. I mean, sometimes it's a malicious employee who's pissed off at you, and you have to be aware of that and keep an eye on it. But more likely, the great bulk of incidents are all started through an employee clicking on something, looking at some article that somebody emailed them that they didn't really know, but that looked really interesting, and going to that, and all of a sudden that opening a door for the cyber criminals to get into your system. So if you can't do anything, if you can't afford anything, at least get employee training. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to my partner, Eric Levine, who is co-chairman of the Lindaberry Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Group.
Thank you, Bob. Bob always has the pleasure in our presentations of painting the rosy picture for everyone as to what the world looks like with cybersecurity and incidences out there. My job is to deal with, or at least in this instance, to deal with what happens when things actually go bad and you have a cyber incident. And I use that word specifically when I mention incident as opposed to the word breach, because there's a difference. And that's really the first place everyone needs to start to look when you make a determination that your system or your network has been impacted or penetrated by somebody who may be a hacker. There is a difference between what is an incident and what is a breach. If an outside party gains access to your system, that is certainly a cyber incident, meaning you have an issue that you need to take care of. You should be aware of it. But does it constitute a breach? The word breach actually has some legal connotations to it and dictates how you respond. Generally speaking, a breach occurs when personal information was or is reasonably believed to have been accessed by an unauthorized person. So how can you have an incident and not a breach? Well, Bob had said somebody could hack into your system. What if they have hacked into your system, but the personal information in that system has been successfully encrypted or segregated? So somebody is fishing around in your system, but they can't get to the certain type of information which has been deemed personal information. That wouldn't necessarily constitute a breach, depending upon your state law and what industry you're in. And as Bob had mentioned earlier, if you're in a regulated industry like healthcare or finance, there are different requirements that govern you than under regular state laws. So understanding the difference outright will basically guide your response. When you're responding to a cyber incident, you really have 4 goals to keep in mind, and that's detection, containment, analysis, and notification. The first part, obviously, you want to be able to detect whether or not you have something wrong with your system. Bob had mentioned earlier the notion of getting a vulnerability assessment, and once that's done, the detection process isn't over. You constantly need to be vigilant and make sure that your systems have not been impacted. When there is a problem, you need to contain it, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail in a few slides, but it needs to be stopped. Then there has to be an analysis to determine what actually happened, so you know how to respond appropriately and you know how to prevent it in the future. And then the last goal is notification, which under most laws is what you're required to do to let people whose information has been impacted know what happened. And generally speaking, notification helps to close the door on liability. So the first thing you need to do is assess what has occurred. Bob had given some terms earlier about ransomware, hacking, etc. Depending on the nature of the incident, your response will be different. If you're hit with ransomware, your response would certainly be tailored to responding to the threat, seeing if there's a way to undo the threat without having to pay a ransom, and getting your information back. That is a different response. For instance, if you're subject to a denial of service, meaning somebody floods your network so you can't get incoming orders from clients, or if you have a loss of data. And again, the type of incident may dictate the response. So for instance, in New Jersey, if personally identifiable information is breached under the law, the Identity Theft Protection Act, your first step really is to contact the New Jersey State Police and advise them. And then they will let you know what further steps you are to take as it relates to the public. So another thing that Bob mentioned earlier was training and having a plan in place. A critical component of your plan is having what's known as an incident response team. That team is a group of people who are going to respond if there is an incident. Because the truth is, you can't just do this on the fly and have any expectation of being able to handle the problem and run your business at the same time. So as part of your plan, you will create an incident response team, which will consist of an incident leader, the person who is basically going to run the drill. It should contain members of your IT staff who should be able to help you identify some of the more technical components of what happens. You should have a legal or privacy representative, somebody who understands the issues at least related to what privacy concerns are out there and can help guide the notification and make sure that the appropriate steps are taken to prevent unwanted disclosures. You need to have PR involved, HR, and your insurance contact, because each one of those will have a defined role and they'll all be acting in unison. And it's important to have a team because there are going to be many things going on at once and no one person can handle it all. One of the first things that you'll end up doing is contacting outside members in the response team and getting everyone together and saying, okay, we have a problem, our network has been impacted, everybody knows what their role is, here's what we need to do. But before you even do something along those lines, you want to make sure that you contact legal counsel to invoke the privilege. The privilege that Bob had spoken about earlier that deals with your vulnerability assessment also applies to the response of your team. Everything you do, you want to protect with the privilege so it's not able to be disclosed to third parties, because it's possible that your plan, for as well-intentioned as it is and as detailed as it is, you may not run it properly. But you don't want that to be used against you because you're still trying to do the right thing and protect your information. You also want to make sure you have legal counsel running the team and the plan for you, because they'll help you maintain the evidence that you need to do. Everybody who's on your response team should be maintaining logs, communication logs, chain of custody documents to say minute by minute what they do, so that after the smoke clears, you're able to point to your team's efforts and say, here's the steps that we took to try to contain the problem and rectify it and act in a reasonable manner. One of the things that's important here is not only are you trying to solve the problem to get your business up and running, but you're also trying to prepare and protect yourself from potential litigation resulting from the breach. And that could be suits by clients whose information has been disclosed, your own employees, and even regulators and governmental agencies if you're in a regulated industry. It's also critical to not try to solve the problem, the actual breach or the network penetration yourself. Contain it and let a professional, a forensic professional do that for you. You don't want to do something well-intentioned, say trying to use some antivirus software, something to clean your computer, only to find out that you wiped out all the evidence that we needed for the defense. So contain the problem, but don't try to solve the technical components yourself. Once your team is up and running, it's very important to maintain internal and external communications. If you're in the middle of a breach, it will be hectic. It will be a firestorm. So you need to know what everyone is doing. You'll need to advise your organizational leadership to tell them what's going on. You'll need to advise your employees, because you may have a scenario where your employees are getting phone calls from your customers saying, hey, I hear that our information has been made public. What are you doing? So it's important that everyone stay on the same page so that there's a clear message that goes out to everyone. You don't want one of your support staff talking to one of the clients and saying, oh my God, everything is a mess. We're going down. The ship is sinking. You want to make sure that everyone stays on point. So the incident response team has to meet frequently and maintain records of what they're doing minute by minute, hour by hour. Oh, skipped ahead there. With regard to external communications, it's very important for you to determine what, if anything, do you actually have to say to the outside world. This is interesting in that if you don't have a breach, in other words, under the applicable laws that govern you in your industry, personally identifiable information has not been impacted, you've still had a penetration of your system, but you may not be obligated by law to tell everybody exactly what happened. You still may want to do so from a reputational standpoint and to keep your clients and customers up to date and letting them know that you have the problem well in hand. So it's important that you have somebody who can analyze the applicable laws to tell you what your reporting requirements are. It's equally as important that you know what data has been impacted. This is where your IT professionals come in and say, okay, the following files have been impacted. And then you sit down and you determine who is the person who was impacted, what state are they in, because if you do business in multiple states, you could be subject to multiple state laws. There are 50 states in the United States. There are 48 different privacy laws. Each one could have different reporting requirements. So what that will do is change your notification. If you have clients in California, you may be required to tell them something different than you tell your clients in New Jersey. So what you want to do from your notification standpoint is take a look at all the laws that apply, take a look at all the people who have been impacted, the information that's been impacted, sit down and plan out what your external communication will be. Because there is a difference between what's mandated by law and what's discretionary that you choose to do on your own. So we've gone through your cyber breach, you've gotten out of it successfully, and you say to yourself, well, you know what, the hard part's over. It is and it isn't. Once you actually end up responding to the cyber incident and you clarify, rectify the problem, you still need to do a post-incident review and prepare a report. And this is still something that's overseen by counsel, once again, to maintain the privilege. Well, why are you preparing this report? First and foremost, to make sure you've solved the problem. Have we done everything that we were supposed to do? Did we give the proper notice to the people that we were supposed to give? And did we close the gap for the future? We want to make sure this doesn't happen again. Equally important is, did our response team operate the way we were supposed to? Did our plan work? And if it didn't, what can we do to make it work? As Bob said, employee training is static, so is your response plan. Today's threat could be different tomorrow. And then, excuse me, and then the other thing that you want to make sure you're prepared for is any sort of follow-up action that you need to take. For instance, if it turns out that your firewall was inadequate, and that's how the hacker gained access, then what do you need to do? You might need to check your IT budget and upgrade your infrastructure, get new firewalls. If the breach resulted from an action of one of your employees, maybe you need to modify your training or repeat your training. You may also need to talk to the vendors that you deal with if somehow the breach involved them as well. And you want to give follow-up notice to your clients and, if necessary, the governmental agencies to say, hey guys, we told you we had a breach a month ago, we fixed it, we're happy to tell you that we've taken the following steps, you should feel good about yourself. And then unfortunately, you have to prepare for possible litigation. Somebody could always come back and try to sue you for the breach, and you want to make sure, again, that you've circled back and you've closed all the loops, and you can say to a judge or a jury, here were the reasonable steps we took to train, here were the reasonable steps we took to respond, and here were the reasonable steps we took to wrap everything up. And that is all that I have for responding to a cyber incident. And I'm going to turn the program over now to my colleague Andrew Gibbs, who's going to talk about cyber insurance.
Thank you, Eric, and good afternoon, everyone. So we've been talking about some bad stuff. Bob went through a whole bunch of different risks that are out there and the potential damages and potential costs to a business. And one of the things that a business can do is get itself appropriate insurance that can respond to these risks. The problem is that traditional liability insurance and property insurance wasn't designed to deal with these types of risks. These types of risks weren't available and weren't around in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and so the policies were not designed to cover them. And today, particularly most of the CGL policies and property policies now have exclusions that deal with electronic data loss or the use of electronic data loss. And as of 2014, the Insurance Services Office, which essentially drafts the language that goes into a lot of these policies, started putting out exclusions relating to confidential and personal information. So reliance on traditional liability insurance like CGL policies or property policies is a risky proposition in today's business environment. So it's definitely something that needs to be considered. And also, the courts in the United States are not really consistent in their rulings as to whether cyber risks and cyber attacks are covered under traditional policies. For example, some courts have held that electronic data doesn't meet the definition of property damage in CGL policies because it's not real. It's not considered tangible property. Other courts do find that loss of computer data can constitute a direct physical loss under a property policy because it's a computer file or a computer data that can be lost. So a lot of the courts are going in different directions, and it creates a lot of uncertainty for companies and even for lawyers that deal with these issues. So it just kind of establishes the point that reliance on just straight traditional insurance is risky. But the good thing is that there's now an insurance product out there that can help protect against cyber risks, and that's essentially it's essentially called cyber insurance policies. These are readily available in the market, and right now there's over 60 companies, including very large companies like AIG, Chubb, and Lloyd's, that offer these products. And essentially, there are a lot of different types of products that are available. You could get a standalone cyber insurance policy, or you might even get an endorsement to your current policy that covers cyber risks. And ultimately, most of these policies will provide both third-party liability coverage and first-party coverage. Third-party, for example, would be if your company had a data breach and some of your client or customer information was stolen, and then you were sued by one of the customers. The insurance company would then step in and provide defense counsel to defend that claim in many circumstances. Or if you need to pay for certain costs, direct costs that were related to the investigation of the loss, in other words, to try to figure out how it happened, to hire an attorney to deal with the consequence. Or even if, for example, there was a ransomware attack and your business was down for a week and you had business interruption claim. These types of policies could potentially provide you with first-party coverage to cover those types of losses. But unlike traditional insurance, which has been developed over years of regulation and coverage litigation, the terms and conditions and exclusions in cyber policies are not uniform. It really varies from company to company and policy to policy. But there are lots of different options out there for companies dealing with these types of risks. Another good thing about this type of coverage is that the insurance companies can sort of tailor the type of insurance that you could get based upon your company's specific financial situation or even specific risk, depending on the type of business that you do. For example, Bob had mentioned some companies are involved in medical information, some companies are involved in dealing with banks, and an insurance company can sort of tailor the coverage based on the specific type of risk. And one of the most important points that I want to make, particularly with regard to insurance, and it's very important, is that the cost of cyber insurance is not as significant as a lot of companies believe. And that's a real misconception among small and medium-sized businesses, that it's just too expensive and it's cost prohibitive. We deal with a number of insurance brokers, and we understand that a small company can secure $1 million of cyber coverage for as little as a few $1,000s premium. So that's really not that significant of a cost, particularly when you're going to compare it with the potential damage or the potential cost of a cyber breach. I mean, Bob had mentioned that some of the figures, it's almost $900,000 is the average cost to deal with a data breach, and almost $1 million is the average cost to help a company restore its reputation. So when you look at those costs and you compare it with the relatively small cost of cyber insurance, it may be a good investment for your company. The one thing that we should also stress is that your company can also get more favorable coverage and possibly more favorable premium and or a deductible if your company has a robust cybersecurity program, both in terms of technology, having a good firewall, and also to establish some of the policies and procedures that Bob and Eric talked about a little bit earlier. If you have that before you get the cyber insurance, you may very well get a much more favorable coverage and premium. So what's the takeaway with the insurance is that we feel fairly strongly that companies should consider cyber insurance. There are a significant increase in cyber attacks against small and medium-sized businesses. And given the uncertainty that in coverage that I mentioned with traditional insurance and the uncertainty in the law with regard to coverage for cyber risks, relying on just traditional insurance like CGL policies is a risky proposition in today's business environment. It really makes sense to take a closer look at your, as we mentioned earlier, your crown jewels, to take a look at the type of information that you have and essentially figure out if cyber insurance is a good investment for your company. And ultimately what you want to do is you want to talk to your broker to see what kind of coverage you have and what kind of information you have, and ultimately make that decision. And obviously, if your company is involved in more significant business or have a more complicated business, or there are questions about what your policies provide or what kind of coverage you have, we would certainly recommend that you retain an attorney to deal with these issues. But the bottom line is cyber insurance is a good option for companies to protect against a lot of the risks that we've been talking about.
Great. Well, thank you to all of our presenters today. I think that it was an informative program, and we'd like to thank everyone who joined us for your time and attention this afternoon. We hope that you gained valuable information that can be put into practice within your organization. Lindaberry's cybersecurity and data privacy team is available to answer any questions you may have regarding steps you can take to protect your business from cyber attack. Please feel free to contact any of today's presenters for more information. Again, we thank you for participating and hope that we will see you again at future educational events hosted by our firm. Thank you.